Well, thank you very much for that. My topic is how we got here. And if I could find my speech, I'd be much more interesting, or at least slightly so. Here we are. I want to thank you all very much for coming out. And I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces. Everybody is welcome. We have a terrific lineup of speakers who I also thank very much for their willingness to come to the conference and present bold ideas for fixing the status quo, which, if you're classically educated, you know is Latin for the mess we're in. And I want to start out by asking how we got here, which might seem like a silly question. You know, you drove, or in my case, we flew through an ice storm and arrived an hour late. And it's easy to be grouchy about that, although just as we touched down, there was a perky announcement saying, those of you on this plane who have a connector to Lethbridge will be interested to know that it's been canceled. And I thought, okay, well, I'm where I want to be, so I'm actually not in a bad situation. Plus, you know, I was in Ottawa, and then I sat down in a chair, and then I spent the next 4 hours going 500 miles an hour, a mile up in the sky, to arrive where I wanted to go. So grim as the situation is, it could always be worse, so we must remember to count our blessings. Because we have considerable blessings, and the task before us can be accomplished, but we also have considerable problems, or we would not be here. Those of you who get my Twitter feed know that my wish I'd said that for Monday was, when the horse dies, dismount. It's like much wisdom, this was said by Anonymous. You know, the thing on the internet about don't believe everything you read. Don't believe every quotation that you read on the internet, Abraham Lincoln. Right? Some of these things tend to stick to people if they're considered to be wise. None of them ever stick to me, but I didn't invent that one. But it is one of those things that I when I do those quotations of the month, I try to source them so that if I'm an idiot, I'm in company. And this is certainly something that you see a great deal, I think, in politics. There's an enormous tendency of people to gather together, so that if they're wrong in a group of people. On the other hand, the people who are in this room have a demonstrated willingness to be right, even if they're all alone. So that's a good start. I know that I am addressing people who are not responsible for the mess that we're in, and also who are likely to be part of getting us out of it, precisely because of their willingness to stand up for what they know is right, even if it leads to a certain clearing of the room. That is not an endorsement, of course, of rudeness, but it is an endorsement of being firm on principle while being as pleasant as you can manage in manner. And we're here to talk about a whole bunch of problems in governance, including the very real and growing phenomenon of Western alienation. A sense of people in Alberta and the other Western provinces, less in BC, but noticeable there too, that it is simply not possible to get Canada to work properly. And that is a very strange state of affairs. We say, how did we get here? How did a country as fortunate as Canada? You know, people talk about our natural resources. Well, these days they talk badly about them, but they used to talk about them as though they were actually a good thing. But we have a political tradition derived from Magna Carta. We are a nation founded in liberty. We have, for the most part, are far from the world's problems. We have every advantage just about that a country could have. How can we possibly be gathered together wondering if the thing can be fixed? So this is what the real, how did we get here? How did we get Canada and Alberta into a situation where we need to have this meeting? And how can we stop doing what we have been doing? And to me, the point of the gathering, we're going to look at all kinds of policy areas and hear all kinds of very detailed explanations and proposals for how to fix it. But fundamentally, we need to change what is possible because we have got where we are by drifting, by accepting a gradual deterioration that has become a more and more dramatic deterioration as things have gone on. And in order to make it stop, we have to put our feet down and insist that drifting into disaster is not a worthy plan of intelligent, self-respecting people in a country, particularly with all Canada's advantages, in a province with all Alberta's advantages. The next slide, if you like trendy buzzwords, and who among us doesn't? Well, I do, because otherwise I wouldn't be using PowerPoint at all, right? There's a thing called the Overton window. And when people are talking about public policy, they use this to illustrate that there are a whole range of things that you might in principle be doing from one end of the spectrum to the other. And some of them are inside the window of reputable discourse, and some of them are not. And by and large, you can count on politicians to look for the one that's right about in the middle of the Overton window, whatever it is. And some people are trying to move it up or down in the window. What I hope we're going to try and do is change what's in the window to make it possible to talk about things that at the moment it is not in politics possible to talk about. As Danny has mentioned that his career as a UCP candidate was tragically cut short, or perhaps not so tragically, because if you are in politics, if you are a nominated candidate, especially in the very centrally controlled parties that we have today, it's very hard to talk about things that matter. You're given a set of talking points, and if you don't adhere to them, you're going to be in a heap of trouble. We're not here to generate talking points in this conference, though. We are here to talk about things that matter. The next slide is just as an example, sort of an Overton window about healthcare. We don't have a panel on healthcare. I think maybe one year we'll do a whole conference on it because it's such an important topic. You know, healthcare takes up over 40% of the program spending in every province and territory in Canada. Over 40%. And that number is going to keep going up because the population is aging, and I'm sorry to tell you here, my hip kind of hurts, that sometimes as you get older, things don't work quite the way they did when you were 25. It's been known to happen. And when you look at proposals for healthcare reform, they very much tend to be, let's do it all again and hope it works better this time. At the moment in Ontario, I think the plan is to swear that they will not privatize anything and resort to streamlined central planning. And, you know, streamlined central planning is one of those things often discussed but never seen. It's out there with the unicorns somewhere. And yet we have all this hoo-ha and ruckus. We got to elect a conservative government. And on the other side, oh, Doug Ford, he's so conservative. You know, he's got a plot to destroy healthcare. And when he gets into office, what he does is he just reverts to the kind of conventional wisdom, and that's how we got here. Now, I often talk about timidity in politics, but as a matter of fact, I think that in some ways I'm being unfair to some politicians. Unfortunately, I'm being unfair to the wrong ones. On the left, there has been considerable boldness. There has been a clear vision that they have adhered to and advanced over many decades. And someone like Tommy Douglas was not afraid when people told him the Canadian public will never accept socialized medicine. They'll call you a communist. You'll have all the vested interests against you. This will happen, that will happen. And Tommy Douglas said, I don't care. I'm sure this is right, and I'm going to try and make it happen. And in the end, he did make it happen, and I think it was a disaster. But it happened because he didn't chicken out, because he didn't get intimidated, because he did not adopt the ideas of his adversaries in some quest to get elected endlessly for no very clear purpose. And I think that if we are to change the way things are going, if we are to turn things around in Alberta, if we are to fix the Canadian Federation, if we are to fix education, it is critical that the people in this room, when the conference is over, inspire their friends, their neighbors, their disgruntled people they know to be willing to stand up for what is right and to say, we have not just one dead horse here, we have a whole herd of them scattered on the ground, and as long as we keep trying to ride them, we're not going to get where we need to go. Again, it isn't always an easy thing to do. I was in the airport, coming here, in the Ottawa airport, there was a book that said, the title was something like The Courage to be Unpopular. And I didn't realize it took courage. I thought it could just, you know, general array of disagreeable personality qualities that I possess would ensure this. You know, didn't know it was going to require me to have a spine. Pretty upset by that, actually. But as Danny mentioned, we had this issue with John Carpe. And supposedly the reason we shouldn't have him here is that at one point, in a poorly chosen metaphor for which he promptly apologized, he compared the rainbow flag to the swastika, which he should not have done, and he knows he shouldn't have done it. But I was on Danielle Smith's show right after a guy was saying, oh, boo hiss down with John Carpe, never have him on your show, never have him anywhere, who actually tweeted a cartoon comparing Christians to Nazis. And this is a very interesting business because this cartoon was originally about, next slide, the persecution of Christians. And the professor in question took the tweet down when he realized the cartoon had been altered. But he never apologized for comparing Christians to Nazis. And yet he said we shouldn't allow John Carpe here because he compared gay activists to Nazis and then apologized. And they thought they could bully us into canceling John's appearance. And they said he hadn't really apologized when he had, and all kinds of things. And we said, you're not going to win the argument that way. Because what you really object to is that John is challenging orthodoxy on sexual matters in the education system. That's what you really don't want to have happen. And we are not going to shut somebody up because they're challenging orthodoxy. If we decide they're wrong, we will cease to take the same position that they take. We will do our best to debate the matter courteously. We will make up our minds, and at some point we will decide things are this way or things are that way. But we're not going to be bullied out of listening to ideas we think are important and defending them if we decide that they are right. Now, there's an important reason why this is hard for people to do, unless they have the courage to be unpopular, or as I say, just the natural gifts that some of us were given. And it goes back the first time Danny invited me to one of these gatherings. I was not able to attend in person, but I made a set of videos about 3 books that I thought people in the audience would find rewarding to read. And one of them was, next slide, is Thomas Sowell's A Conflict of Visions, in which Sowell, having been an academic and a polemicist for some years, was reflecting on the fact that he seemed to be arguing with the same people on issue after issue, even when there was no obvious connection between, in those days, the issues would have been abortion on demand, the minimum wage, and aid to the Contras in Nicaragua. And he started to think to himself, what is it at a very kind of gut level that makes a person a liberal or a radical on the one hand, or a conservative or a libertarian on the other? And it comes down to this line from George Will that if you disagree with a conservative, he'll call you stupid, but if you disagree with a liberal, he'll call you mean. That on one side of the spectrum, people place far more emphasis on good intentions, and on the other side, far more on effective methods. And on the good intention side, there's a tendency to believe we can have all good things at once if we want them. And on the other side, there's a willingness to acknowledge that life involves trade-offs and that there is a dark lining to every silver cloud and that we have to make tough choices. And the result of this is that if you defend the kind of ideas that you're going to be hearing for the most part at this conference, you're going to get called nasty. You're going to be accused of being a homophobe or a racist or some other term that attacks you for the quality of your motives and the unpleasantness of your character, not the foolishness or ill-informed quality of your thinking. And that is really tiring. That wears people down. It's unpleasant to be called dirty names all the time. And in politics, it's very dangerous because the public is very concerned with fairness. And if you are being portrayed as unfair and people are thinking, oh boy, we don't want an unfair person in power, the easiest thing to do is to say, no, I'm really one of you. And for instance, you may have seen the story. Somebody delivered a hateful message to a mosque on UCP letterhead. And Jason Kenney, of course, said, well, in the first place, we didn't write that. In the second place, we absolutely repudiate hate in any form. And of course, next slide, the result is that he's getting hammered for not having done I don't know what. Like maybe he should have converted to Islam. But the idea is, no, Jason Kenney's a mean guy. He's a terrible, awful person. And Jason Kenney spent a great many years, and will do so in the campaign, I'm sure, trying to convince people that he's not an awful person, because you don't like going around being thought of as an awful person. And so it's so easy, as you know, another comment that was to do with the fact that John Carpe was coming here, columnist Don Braid had tweeted that this is a crackpot conference. And I thought, well, that's a quick piece of virtue signaling, right? I'm a good guy. I'm not some rancid homophobe. Oh, boo, down with those people. I thought, look at the lineup and see, how many of the speakers would Don Braid be comfortable debating in public on one of these issues? In fact, how many of them would he even disagree with on critical issues? And yet, it's just, I don't want to be associated with that unpleasant point of view. And so, if you're on the right, you spend a lot of time being criticized for being really mean character. And that can wear people down, and it's one of the things that we need to be aware of, and we need to be willing to reject without acting nasty, because that's one of the reasons why it's a very bad idea for people who are conservative to lose their temper, because they play to the stereotype, and that's a really bad idea. You never want to play to the stereotype. I always say, if people think you're a clown, don't show up in a fright wig with a red nose. But that doesn't mean that you stop saying what you know is right. I should mention, by the way, about the timekeeping. Let me see what's going on here. I have this conflict of interest because I'm the timekeeper, but I'm also the guy talking. And one of the reasons we're in a big mess in Canada and in Alberta is because politicians say one thing and then they get power and they do another. Well, I've got the power right here. But I'm going to stop when my time is up. I don't care how many brilliant slides I don't get to, because we're going to run this conference on time, even if it means I've got to sit down. But before I do, there's a quotation from Jordan Peterson that was another of my quotations of the day back in October. He said, "Nothing brings a better world into being than the stated truth. You're going to have to pay a price for that, but that's fine. You're going to pay the price for everything you do and don't do. You don't get to choose not to pay a price. You get to choose which poison you're going to take. So if you're going to stand up for something, stand up for your truth. It'll shape you." And again, I'm not sure it wasn't the extra slices of pizza that shaped me, but in principle, I think Jordan Peterson has a very good point there. And we need to tell the truth, and we need to tell the truth about the horses that have died, including, and some of you will have heard me talk about this before, so I'll go through the slides quickly. We cannot wait for growth to eliminate the deficit. We have been waiting 60 years for growth to eliminate the deficit. When the gate opens, that horse is on the ground. It is not moving. It is not about to leap up and get going. I mean, it's a very tempting thing. Years ago, David Frum wrote about what he thought was something wrong with Reaganomics, but he said, what an enormously attractive position. No more frugality, no more cheese paring, no more throwing widows out into the snow. It's so nice to say growth will solve the problem. But, have we got the Ontario revenue up? Yeah. Ontario doesn't have a revenue problem. Ontario has a spending problem. And you can't fix a spending problem on the revenue side. That is one of the truths that we must be willing to encourage people to stand up for on the grounds that going bankrupt is really bad. It's not because we're mean people. It's not because we want to take away programs that are doing wonderful things. It's because we see the very negative consequences of insolvency. Canada, next slide, also does not have a revenue problem. Revenue is pouring in staggering quantities. I took a lot of heat in some quarters for saying the Harper Tories disappointed me fiscally and in other ways. But if you look at that chart and you say a quarter century of work between the 1987 Winnipeg Convention, where reform was founded, and the election of two minorities and a majority, a quarter century of work for that, if you were an alien, would you know when the frugal conservatives took over from those free-spending liberals? You couldn't tell. You know what the result of all that was, of course, was Justin Trudeau. And his idea of budgetary success is for spending to go up by another $35 billion over 4 years. Now, apparently that's okay because revenue is going to go up by $55 billion. Well, let me tell you, if revenue goes up by $55 billion in 4 years and we've still got a deficit, we didn't have a revenue problem. And I don't see what Andrew Scheer is going to do differently. And I'm afraid the same is true in Alberta. I know people love Ralph Klein. Yay, Ralph. But the problem with Ralph Klein is that after temporary spending restraint, have we got Alberta up? I can't see the slides. When the money came back in, he took the lid off spending because he didn't make structural reforms. Ralph Klein didn't think the big programs were a bad thing. He just thought bankruptcy was a bad thing. But he thought the big programs were on the whole beneficial. And the result of that is that Alberta was on track to the ruinous position it's in now long before the NDP took over. Again, the aliens couldn't tell. If you showed them Alberta's budget chart and you said, when did we have a frugal premier in this province, they might guess it was 93 to 97. But they would certainly not identify the Klein years. And then, again, I showed this slide last time, where Alberta spends its money. And tell me, if Jason Kenney and the UCP are elected, what you think they're going to cut. Of their own accord, nothing. They will increase spending. We have to change the climate. We have to say, if these programs worked the way we're told they work, they would be affordable. They would foster prosperity. They would foster social cohesion. They would solve the problems they are addressing. What we are doing is we are buying problems. We are paying for things we don't want, and we're getting more and more of them. And that is where we got here in part because conservatives generally, not the people in this room, but conservatives generally accepted the theories of their adversaries and then ran in circles screaming and shouting. And it's partly why conservative politicians need such carefully tailored spending points, because they have to be prevented from blurting out anything conservative, and they have to avoid tripping over the contradictions in their positions. And it's not just in Canada. Again, I showed this slide last year. I'm still steaming over it. It was Donald Trump's budget director who's laying out deficits of $700 billion from here to eternity. And he said, I probably could have made it balanced, but it would have taken funny numbers to do it. Well, yeah, that or cuts. You know, that is such a running up the white flag. It's a line from the Goon Show that he rallied the men round the white flag. And that's been going on for a long time. But it can't continue, especially with the demographic crisis that's coming. You know, the population is aging. As people age, they take more on social services, including health care. Those who are working for the public sector are going to be collecting pensions. Bill Tufts will scare us all silly with that. Looking forward to that very much. And they contribute less because they're working less. And the programs that you can't afford with the age pyramid we had 10 or 15 years ago, you're certainly not going to be able to afford with the age pyramid we have 10 or 15 years from now, and you don't want a hard landing. We can't continue in the direction we're going and expect, or the horse being in the condition it's in the direction we're not going, and expect things to improve. And then there's this problem of one of the things we're talking about is education, because one of the reasons we're in this mess is we've allowed the education system to be completely radicalized from top to bottom. And we know what's happening, and we have to stand up to it. And there was a column by Sue Ann Levy in the Toronto Sun. Now, columnists don't write headlines. If you're ever writing a note telling a columnist off for being a fool, don't say, and how could you put that headline on it, because it's the one sin they didn't commit. But the headline on the column was a good one. It said, Ontario students deserve education, not social justice indoctrination. So it's not just us, and it's not just John Carpe, and we're not a bunch of kooks. Something's wrong in the education system. And she said, if you clicked on the website of the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, you'd have invited to join this year's Women March. It mentions Donald Trump, Doug Ford, hate and social justice all in the same paragraph, blah, blah, blah. And she said there's other nonsense on that homepage, including a media release about their legal challenge of the Ford government's mishandling of the sex ed curriculum, saying it has, quote, put students at risk. And then she says, I'll tell you what's put students at risk. It's this union's single-minded focus on social justice issues that have absolutely nothing to do with a student's ability to read, write, add, subtract, multiply, and divide properly. Now, I don't know if she wrote that column, whether Sue Ann Levy then went and applied for her dangerous homophobe card or not. If she did, I expect she was rejected on the grounds that she's openly homosexual. But these days, that might not insulate her against the accusation that she has internalized the oppression and blah, 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 blah. But the fact is that you've got a gay columnist for the Toronto Sun saying the education system indoctrinates kids into social justice. Something's wrong with the school system, and it's impeding people's ability to think critically, including about budgetary issues. So we have to do something about this. And here's a question. Call me a crackpot. But my friend Andrea Mrozak with Cardis has raised this one. Why does the sex ed curriculum not mention marriage? Marriage is one of the most significant things in the whole realm of boy meets girl, or these days boy meets boy. It is enormously important to you and your children whether you get married and stay married. You would think a curriculum about healthy sexuality would have something to say about it, but it doesn't. And there's nothing cranky and there's nothing mean about raising that question. If you're concerned about the well-being of children, you're concerned about the conditions under which they're raised, and you are concerned about the kind of families that are statistically shown to be more likely to produce children who flourish. You know, if good intentions could solve everything, we wouldn't be having this conference. We'd be living in paradise. You know, sunny ways would be all we needed, and we would be a bunch of unwashed hotheads. But again, you look at another thing that is going so badly it's astonishing, and that, of course, is the state of the Federation. We've got a session on trying to fix the Federation because things are so terrible. I mean, it's one of these things, it's almost like tag team wrestling, you know. For decades, Quebec was so disgruntled, there was nothing you could do. And finally, they sort of calmed down a little bit. Now the West is horrendously disgruntled. You know, I realize it's the human condition to be disgruntled, but how is it possible that we never get a time in Canada and we think, yeah, it's pretty good that we're all Canadians and, you know, we have our charming differences, but they're not things that tear us apart, you know, chacun son goût and that sort of thing. But I can't help thinking, by the way, I know when we sing the national anthem in Alberta, we don't always do the French part, which is considered de rigueur to do back in Ontario. It's terribly politically correct, you know, and we sing, you know, Carton bas, c'est porter l'épée, c'est porter la croix, which for those of you who do speak French know means because your arm knew how to carry the sword and the cross. Yay, it's a crusade. Like, you know, you'd think maybe we could sing that without feeling resentment. But it's astonishing the extent to which polls show that we dislike one another, that the regions feel alienated, everybody thinks everybody else hates them. It's not working, and we don't have to pretend it is working. It's absurd that we should be cowed into saying, isn't everything marvelous? No, everything is not marvelous. You know, some people say, oh, it's hopeless, you know, Alberta should just separate. Well, there might be a better solution. I certainly hope so, because that one has some downsides to it. But it's no good pretending Albertans are not unhappy or that they don't have good reason to be unhappy. I said, Gord's got his never elect another Trudeau buttons. They're going to outsell my DVDs by a wide margin, I have a feeling. You know, it's not a partisan gathering. It's not as though Stephen Harper actually got it better. And as you may remember, the founding of the Reform Party was triggered by a feeling that the federal government was being far too favorable to Quebec, and that was under another Conservative administration. If it were only Liberals doing this, then the solution might well be politics. But the trouble is, it's everybody, and we have to change the political culture, among other things. And again, this is another slide I recycled from last year. Recycling is good, right? I'm a good person. Hooray, I love the environment. We should be on the slide about never firing government workers. I told you I was going to skip a bunch of great slides. I didn't mention that I was going to talk about them in the wrong order, but that's, you know, into every life a little rain must fall. If it's not freezing rain and you're not unable to get to Lethbridge, you know, be happy. Because I have to finish in 6 minutes or I'm a hypocrite as well as a bore. Government isn't working. People don't get fired in government no matter how terrible their performance is. And that's bad for everybody, including people in government, because they're surrounded by colleagues who should have been encouraged to pursue a different career. I was actually just, I'm sorry to say that I have to engage in a renovation of a part of my house, which is going to renovate itself if I don't act first. And I was talking to somebody in the renovation trade who said, well, I was a high-flying public servant. And I hated my life so much I quit to become a contractor. Now I'm happy because I'm doing something meaningful. You know, people are unhappy in the public sector. They're doing meaningless work. It's ridiculous to pretend that things are good. And yet that is what we continually find ourselves doing. It's sort of thought to be rude. There is another method. There is another way of doing it, and this is one which I've stolen from Peter Hawley. He may steal it back later on, but it's from Roger Douglas. Roger Douglas said one of the things you have to do in public policy if you want to make reforms is let the dog see the rabbit. Now, if you're in politics, don't call the public a dog, but the point is you have to show people where this is going that will be good. You have to have the courage of your convictions and say, we're going to change things, we're going to go through some difficulties in order to get somewhere we need to get to that we can get to. That there is a whole other way of doing it. And, you know, in a funny way, everybody knows that. If you're a fan of Jay Budziszewski, his book, What We Can't Not Know, Budziszewski thinks that nobody deep down is not aware of fundamental moral truths. however much they may rationalize. You know, Ralph Klein, we should have a quotation from Ralph Klein here about how he was going to go after the big spending areas. We had to go hunting where the ducks are. And that was true, and people elected him and people loved him. He just didn't do it. But it's still true. Governments spend their money on big social programs. And unless you want major tax increases or big deficits or believe in the magic of growth, you're talking about cutting social programs. And you could decide that's an unpalatable alternative and say so frankly, or you could decide that's what we need to do and say so frankly. But the problem is we have failed to deal with this issue over 60 years. And, you know, saying there's no need for it, growth will solve the problem. We'll deal with it by getting rid of excessive bureaucracy. We'll get rid of waste. Oh, we'll deal with the cronyism. That sounds easy. But you know in your own life what happens when you take the easy way out. I'll shovel the driveway tomorrow. Maybe it'll melt. I don't even want to think what mine's going to look like when I get back, but that's not the point. Remember Stephen Harper's incrementalism. He said, we're not going to promise anything big because we don't want to scare voters. We're not going to do anything big because we don't want to scare voters. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to sort of sneak into power, and then we'll make small, sneaky changes, and we'll hold power for the next 6 or 8 elections, and by the end of it, we'll have a candidate that's genuinely conservative. It didn't work, right? They lost after one term because they didn't do anything to excite the base, and they just drifted into worse and worse trouble. And then the Liberals came along and said, hey, we can fix all this. And people got all excited about the prospect of fixing it. They're now perhaps experiencing buyer's remorse. But we are not going to get out of the mess we're in by the same things that got us into it, by an unwillingness to stand up for what we know is right. Remember Benjamin Franklin in Poor Richard's Almanac. This should be the second last slide. He that resolves to mend hereafter resolves not to mend now. And whenever you hear a conservative politician saying, oh, we can't say that now, remember what Franklin was getting at. Because, you know, they say we can't say it because we have to get elected. Well, if they do get elected, the next day they're worried about getting reelected. They never stop worrying about getting elected and start thinking about deserving to be elected unless we create that parade. So, we're going to hear a lot of really good policy ideas and some pretty scary stuff to go along with it over the course of the next 2 days. But all of it, I suggest, has to be framed, we are resolved to mend now. Because I chose this quotation of the day. I try and do them in advance because you know what life can be like, but this one was chosen with an eye to the conference a week ago. It's from Ronald Reagan. He said, they say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right. And that is how we are going to get from here to where we want to be. Thank you.